Hi everyone, and welcome to this session of our course on climate change and migration. This week we're going to be looking at issues related to climate change, conflict and security. What I'd like to do before we begin though is just give everyone else a couple more minutes to join the live stream and get themselves settled down, and then we will begin. I'm here today with Leanne, who is on the chat function. So if you have questions throughout the live stream, please do ask them via chat and we will tackle them at the end of the session. What would be really useful now is if someone can just indicate really quickly in chat that they can hear my voice. Okay, great, excellent. So the next thing I'm going to do is share my screen and then we will begin the session. Okay, so let's begin. And what I'm going to do first is, as ever, just give a very quick recap of where we've got to with the course, the sessions that we've had, and how the current session fits in with what we've just learned and what's coming up next. So as you'll remember, the first 3 sessions of the course really looked at the mechanics of climate-linked migration and displacement. It looked at who was forced to move by climate-related hazards, why that happened, and the circumstances of the people who found themselves migrating and displaced by changes in our climate. The second part of the course, which is the part of the course that we are in now, looks at the politics and policy of climate-linked migration. So it's looking at the ideas that underpin how, as a society, we respond to climate-linked migration, and it's looking at the specific policies that states, governments, city authorities, local authorities, or international agencies, it's looking at the policies that they use to try and deal with climate-linked migration in one way or another. So the first part of this politics and policy session is where we are at the moment. And in the politics and policy session so far, we've looked at the idea of neoliberalism, which underpins a lot of the thinking about climate-linked migration and how we react to it. Last time, so 2 weeks ago, we looked at inequality. We looked at the political idea of inequality and how different people, depending on where they live, their religion, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, are affected differently by climate-linked migration. Today, we are looking at the idea of security and conflict. We're looking at how the idea of security underpins a lot of the response to climate-linked migration. So that's what's happening today. And then after that, we're going to delve more specifically into some of the policy responses to climate-linked migration. And then finally, in the final 2 weeks of the course, final 2 months of the course, in November and December, we'll be looking at some case studies. So right now, we're right in the middle of understanding the politics and policy of climate-linked migration and how our societies across the world react to it. And what we're looking at today is the idea of security and conflict and what bearing those issues have on how we respond to this issue. So I'm going to now just give a brief outline of what we're going to try and cover today. So the key question, the defining question of this session really is this. It's what is the relationship between climate change and conflict? How is it that changes in our climate, changes in the environment, affect patterns of armed conflict and violence across the world. How is it that that happens, and how, as a society or as governments, are we responding to it? I want to say a couple of things about what this session is and isn't, because this is a huge topic. It's a huge and controversial issue, trying to understand climate-linked conflict. So it's important for us to look at what kinds of things we can answer today, what kinds of things we can delve into, where we can get to with our learning on it, and understand the limitations of what we can do in a 1 hour session. So I'm going to say briefly what we are and aren't going to do. What I'm not going to do is present you with a conclusive answer. I'm not going to present you with a kind of a conclusive, fully formed explanation that you'll be able to go away with and say, well, I went to this lecture, I joined this live stream, and I can tell you that climate change is going to impact conflict in the following ways, X, Y, and Z, right? Instead of doing that, what I'm going to try and do is give you an understanding of the analytical tools and the research behind this incredibly complex area, so that you can do two things. The first one is draw your own conclusions, come to your own conclusion about what you think that evidence tells us, give you what you need that you can explore that evidence and analyze that evidence for yourself and draw the conclusions from it that you think are appropriate. The second thing is give you enough of an overview of this academic field and the research literature in it so that you can investigate further in your own time. As I said, this is a huge topic, right? We're talking about a hugely complex field of conflict and the question of armed violence, and we're really trying to understand it on a huge scale. You know, we're not looking geographically very specifically anywhere in particular, so that might be something that you want to investigate for yourself in the future. So my aim here is to give you enough of a background and enough of an understanding that you can firstly draw your own conclusions from the evidence, and secondly, you feel confident in exploring the evidence further and investigating specific locations or specific instances of climate-linked conflict that you are interested in. So that's what this session is and what it isn't, and what I hope that you will understand by the end of it. So the next thing that we need to look at is to really come up with a definition of what we mean by conflict, right? We're investigating the question of how climate change and how climate-linked migration become a security issue. And in order to do that, we need to understand exactly what it is that we mean when we talk about that, exactly what it is that we mean when we talk about armed conflict related to climate change. So here are the list of the things that I'm including in what we're going to look at today. So I'm not saying that this is a definition of conflict. I'm saying that these 5 things, these 5 bullet points on the screen now are the types of conflict and the types of violence that we're going to be examining, and we're going to be looking at how climate change relates to each of these. So the 5 things are, firstly, interstate warfare, when governments take their military to war with the military of another state. So two countries engaging in armed conflict with each other. It's the first type of conflict that we're going to be examining. Secondly, civil war, where 2 military forces within a country go to war, usually where one of those military forces is the existing government or represents the existing government. Thirdly, intercommunal conflict, which is slightly different to civil war and usually means instances where 2 armed non-state groups are fighting each other, where one of them isn't necessarily representing the government or the main military force of that country, right? So where kind of 2 non-state groups are fighting each other within a country. The fourth one is interpersonal violence. And what we mean by this is something much more like violent crime, where people act violently towards each other, but not necessarily as part of an organized armed force. And then finally, instances of rioting and civil disobedience, which may or may not be violent. So instances where people are kind of engaging in street violence, as rioting, or where they are engaged in various kinds of civil disturbance or protest or uprising. Okay? And what we're going to be doing is looking at how climate change or how changes in our environment can potentially reshape each of these security issues. So the next question is, how is it that we can go about investigating this, right? How is it that we can draw on various kinds of data and various kinds of information to try and understand the ways in which climate change might affect each of these types of violence or each of these types of security issue? So the three key investigative strategies that are open to people, open to academics really, who are investigating this, are firstly data and correlation. So taking a data set about armed violence, a data set about conflict, or a data set about violent crime of some kind, and then correlating that with another data set that they have about the climate. And that could, for example, be about rainfall, it could be about temperature, it could be about instances of drought. And then using various kinds of analytical methods to try and find a correlation between those two sets of data. The next investigative method that people have is around interviews. And it's about asking people who have been involved in an armed conflict of one sort or another what they think are the driving forces behind that conflict. Asking people what it was that meant that they felt that they either had to or wanted to engage in some kind of armed violence, right? And we can often gain insights about the drivers behind that conflict by asking the people who have been involved in it in one way, either involved in it as military actors or caught up in those acts of violence, those wars as civilians. The third key way that we have of investigating this question is through case study. So through taking a particular episode of armed conflict and reviewing as much as available of the literature about that conflict. And from that overview of the literature, from all those other investigations that have been made of that episode of conflict, trying to draw out what the driving forces behind it are or were, and within that, asking the question whether climate change or changes in the environment are a significant driver within that specific case study. So those are the three key ways that are open to us as we try to investigate these questions. The one that I'm going to be focusing on mostly throughout this session is this first one of data and correlation, looking at how we can use a number of different data sets to try and answer this question of how climate change and these various security issues are connected. So the first thing that we need to get to grips with is, what kind of data do we have about armed conflict? What kind of data is available if we want to make those kinds of investigations? So remember here that our eventual aim is to combine this with another data set about the changing environment and find a correlation. So the first thing that we need to get to grips with is, what data do we have about conflict? What I'm showing you here is an example of one such piece of data, one such data set. It's a graph produced using data that's collected by an organization called PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And what you can see there is, this is even before we've attempted to kind of combine the data with anything else or look for any kind of correlation. This is just a representation of that conflict data stretching over the last half century or so, and giving an indication of the number of people that have been killed and injured each year as a result of armed violence. And the reason that I'm showing you this is just to give you an indication, firstly, that that kind of data exists, right? It is, there are a number of different data sets which collect information about the number of people who are killed and injured or in one way or another caught up in armed conflict. And what we can see here is that that data is represented across a time series. So we can see the number of people who are affected by conflict increasing and decreasing over the last half century. We can also do other things with that same data. So if what you can see on your screen now is, rather than a time series representation of that data, is a geographical representation of some of the same data. So what we can see there is the countries that are more severely affected by armed conflict, the countries where a greater percentage of the population have been killed, injured, or caught up in armed conflict in one way or another. So what I'm getting at here is that very often the data that we have available to us is both time series. We can look at changes over time, but it's also geographically specific. We can pull out from that data particular locations that have been impacted particularly severely or less severely, and look at what the differences between those locations might be. It's also possible to have very, very specific geographical location data about the location of armed conflict. So what I'm showing you here is actually information from a different data set. And what we're seeing here is geolocated data about armed conflict taking place in Yemen. So what we can see there is, as well as being able to understand that an entire country has been affected by armed conflict, we can see very specifically down to the town, city, or region level where those instances of armed conflict are taking place and where people are being affected, injured, or killed by that violence. So the point that I'm making generally here is that we're able to do quite sophisticated things with the data that we have on armed conflict. We're able to look at changes over time. We're able to look at the differences between particular countries, and we're able to use very, very specific geolocated data to enable us to examine exactly where and therefore when particular episodes of violence are taking place. What I want to do now is move on to the second part of the equation, looking at the data that we have available on weather and climate. So if you'll remember, what our eventual aim is to look at potentially how we can combine those two forms of data to reach some conclusion about the connection between climate change and conflict. So there's an awful lot of data available about changes in climate and weather. What you can see there is data in a time series showing years in which there were temperature and heat anomalies causing dry periods and drought. So we can see that different years have different episodes of dryness and drought, changes over time. That's just one example. What we can see here is another time series representation of instances of flooding over time. The point that I'm making is that there are lots and lots of different data sets about climate and weather. And we're able to, for example, look very geographically specifically. It's very often the case that countries have their own data on climate. That data is then often combined so that we can create regional or even global data sets. And what that means is that we can then look at quite specific changes in the climate and their relationship to armed conflict. So we could, for example, search for a correlation between drought and armed conflict, or changes in rainfall, or changes in temperature and heat anomalies, and try to understand which of these types of weather anomaly, which of these types of changes in the climate are the ones that may or may not be creating changes in armed conflict. We do, of course, also have data on various kinds of different disasters, on typhoon and hurricane strikes, on flash flooding, for example, and we can also bring those forms of data into play and try to look at correlations between, for example, flooding in a particular place and changes in the levels of armed violence. So that's the data that we have available. To give you a kind of very rough sketch outline of what the research methodology is then, is you take a data set on weather and climate, you take a data set on armed conflict and violence, and you then use various kinds of analytical tools and methods, different kinds of statistical tests to try and see if there is a correlation between those two things. And this is the point where presumably you're hoping that I tell you what the answer is, and I present you with a conclusive explanation. As hopefully you've worked out from these sessions so far, we very rarely reach such a simple answer. So what I'm going to do now is break down that answer into a number of different things that we need to look at. So the first one is we can't draw a very general conclusion about the links between climate change and armed violence, but we can begin to draw some conclusions when we look at correlations between changes in the climate and specific types of armed violence. And one of the first conclusions that it's possible for us to draw, based on correlations so far, is that there doesn't seem to be very much of a relationship between interstate warfare and changes in the climate. So it seems, and fortunately, we should kind of consider this a positive of sorts, that when countries are impacted severely by one kind of climate change event or another, whether it's drought, changes in rainfall, etc., it doesn't seem that those changes particularly drive countries to begin warfare with another country. Okay? However, the answers are not so clear when it comes to civil war, intercommunal conflict, interpersonal violence, and civil disturbance. In those instances, you can see that I put a question mark next to each of them. And the reason that I've done that is because for each of these, there is kind of mixed evidence. So it's the case that some correlation studies have taken data about civil war and taken data about one kind of climate impact or another, and found that in some cases there does seem to be a correlation between an uptick in violence in civil conflicts and changes in, for example, drought. But other studies looking at other places have found no such correlation. So that's why that gets a question mark. Some of the studies point towards a correlation between increases in violence in civil war and changes in the climate, while others don't. And again, we can see the same thing happening with intercommunal conflict. Some studies that have examined episodes of intercommunal conflict or taken data on intercommunal conflict and correlated it with data about changes in the climate, whether that's drought, heat waves, flooding, have found a correlation. However, other studies have not. Again, with interpersonal violence, some studies point to a correlation, others don't, and the same with rioting and civil disturbance. So the conclusion really that we can draw from this is that when it comes to interstate warfare, when it comes to one country going to war with another country, climate change, the impacts of climate change do not seem to be a big driver, an important driver, or to use the correct language, a statistically significant driver of those conflicts. However, when it comes to civil war, intercommunal violence, violent crime, and civil disturbances, some studies point to a correlation and other studies do not. So the next thing that I want to try and do is examine for those studies where they have found a correlation, what is it that drives that? What is the causal link between a change in the climate or an altered weather pattern and an altered pattern of armed violence? Again, you'll perhaps frustratingly see that I put question marks next to each of these, because my aim here is to examine them critically, but to conclude actually that, again, the studies that we have available to us point in a number of different directions. So when researchers produce these correlation studies, what they're finding is that there is, in some cases, a correlation, but it is not always clear why those two things seem to be moving in lockstep. So what those studies show us, for example, is that in some cases, in some countries and in some specific locations, an increase in drought or a decrease in rainfall does seem to lead to an uptick in intercommunal violence or civil warfare. But the question that we still have is, okay, well, we know that there's a correlation there, but the question is why? Why is it that change in rainfall, why is it that increase in drought leads to more armed violence? And there are four explanations here that the researchers who produce these studies often hint at, but unfortunately, as yet, haven't sort of reached a solid conclusion. The first one is that these increases in armed violence are essentially about competition over resources, okay? So that during episodes of drought, certain kinds of resources become more scarce. What we're talking about there really is water and agricultural land, and that conflicts or disputes over those resources, that in periods of more abundant rainfall or of less drought, are resolved peacefully, diplomatically in one way, but that the added drought, the decrease in rainfall, makes those resources scarcer to a greater extent and pushes people to, rather than resolving those disputes diplomatically or peacefully, pushes people to resolving them or attempting to resolve them using armed violence. Now, this is a speculation on the part of the researchers, because what they've really shown is a correlation. They've shown that these two things seem to be moving in lockstep. But just by looking at the data, it isn't necessarily possible to prove that the motivation behind that armed violence was about resources. The next thing that I want to look at is this idea of opportunism. And this is more the case when we're talking about climate-linked disasters, for example, like sudden droughts or hurricane strikes or flash floods. The idea of opportunism is that there are certain armed groups within a society who may be on the verge of engaging in an episode of armed conflict in order to pursue perhaps some other political aim. So the key driver for this group, the key motivation for this group may be political, right? It's very likely that they're engaged in perhaps, for example, some kind of independence struggle or in an attempt to overthrow an existing government for political reasons. And the disaster, the climate-linked disaster that takes place, creates a new element of chaos within that society. It stretches the existing military forces as they try to deal with the disaster. It stretches the resources of the police and the other emergency services. It's enormously disruptive to the whole of society. And that in that moment of disruption, they take the opportunity to engage in the armed conflict in pursuit of their other political objective. So that's what we mean by opportunism. And a number of different papers, a number of different researchers have pointed to that kind of political opportunism as the mechanism that links these kinds of climate-linked disasters to an uptick in armed conflict and violence. However, other studies, other researchers point to different mechanisms. So again, it's speculation. What they found is a correlation, and they are searching around and speculating about why exactly that might have happened. They're informed speculations because these are obviously very skilled researchers who understand the context that they're operating in. They understand the situations that they're investigating. But nonetheless, the data on its own doesn't point conclusively necessarily to one of these particular causal mechanisms linking the change in the atmosphere, the change in the environment, the change in the weather to the change in the pattern of armed conflict. The next one I want to look at is this idea of a relationship between changes in the environmental change, migration, and conflict. Now, I should say, I should preface this by saying that this is one that I'm very skeptical about. I don't particularly think that this is a key causal mechanism that links climate change and armed violence. But I'm gonna sketch out roughly what's meant by it, because it's something that, as you investigate this for yourself, you will encounter in the research literature a lot. So what I want to do is give you an overview of it, but then also tell you why I'm slightly skeptical of it as a key driver of armed conflict. So the argument goes that the impact of climate change, droughts, hurricanes, typhoon strikes, etc., all these things that we're familiar with, force people to move. Now, that's certainly true. That's been the basis of this course so far, is the idea that these episodes of climate impact do cause people to migrate or do displace people. The next step in the argument goes that when people move from one place to another, they encounter people that they are not familiar with. They move to somewhere where they haven't previously been a local resident, and they come into people who are from a different place, maybe a different nationality, a different ethnicity, from a different part of the country, be of a different religion, or some other kind of difference that results from them moving from one place to another and encountering and living amongst the people who already live there. And so the argument goes that those tensions created by those differences eventually result in those people engaging in armed violence with each other. That's the argument, and it's an argument that you see quite a lot. You see it in the research literature, but you also see it in the media as an explanation of why climate change may create these kinds of security crises. They propose that migration is the causal mechanism that links climate change to armed conflict. Now, I'm dubious of this for the simple reason that the vast majority of global migration takes place incredibly peacefully. By and large, when people move from one country to another or from one place within a country to another, they do not engage in armed conflict, right? They go there to find work, they go there to escape violence. The last thing that is going to be a priority for them, the last thing that they want to do is engage in some kind of armed conflict with the people that they are new neighbors with. Similarly, although, of course, we can point to locations, we can point to episodes where there has been tension between newly arrived refugees and migrants and the local population, it is also very frequently the case that there is a huge amount of solidarity between local residents and newly arrived migrants. Especially remember that when we are talking about climate-linked migration and displacement, at the moment, we are largely talking about internal movement. We're talking about people moving internally within their country. And that when that takes place, especially in the context of a disaster like a flood, there is a huge amount of solidarity and a huge amount of help is offered by residents to people who have been displaced into their area. These are their fellow citizens and they want to help them. The people who've been displaced are exhausted and tired from having to move in the context of that disaster. So none of the people in that situation are really looking to start a war with each other. Equally, when people cross borders, it's very often the case that they're fleeing conflict or that they're looking for work. These are not people who are setting out to engage in armed violence. So while these other causal mechanisms, the one around resources, the idea of a causal mechanism around political opportunism, while I think that they have some merit, and that we need to investigate more in order to find out exactly what's going on in those situations, my take on it is that migration actually isn't really, like, migration linked to climate change events isn't going to be a major driver of armed violence. Okay, so let's move on to the final mechanism, and this in many ways is the strangest one, and the one that I find perhaps most troubling and most disturbing. The idea of a psychological driver behind climate-linked violence is really quite troubling in many ways. The suggestion goes that during episodes of extreme heat, people find themselves to be more frustrated. They find that they have a shorter fuse. They find that their tendency to fly off the handle is increased. What we're really talking about here is episodes of, or sort of individual incidents of what we would call violent crime, rather than kind of mass scale organized armed conflict. But there is some evidence pointing towards heat extremes and people engaging in violent crime. And the suggestion is that the causal mechanism between that heat extreme and the uptick in violent crime that does sometimes seem to coincide with those heat extremes is that the causal mechanism is essentially psychological, that there is an increased propensity for acts of violence during those episodes of extreme heat. And that explains, to some extent, those upticks in violent crime that some of the research points to. So those are the causal mechanisms. Those are the ways in which changes in the climate changes in the atmosphere may lead to changes in patterns of armed violence. I think that the question of resources, of opportunism, and of a psychological driver are interesting and plausible and need further explanation for us to fully understand them. I think that the causal mechanism that's proposed around migration has less evidence for it. What I want to move on to now is to try and engage with the fact that I feel like so far I haven't managed to give you a particularly conclusive answer to anything. I know at the beginning of the lecture I said that there wouldn't be any conclusive answers, but nonetheless I can feel like you're probably listening to this thinking, okay, we get that it's complicated, okay, we get that there are lots of different studies, okay, we get that there may be different causal mechanisms that link climate change and armed conflict, but isn't there anything general that we can say? Isn't there some kind of general point that we can make? And I absolutely understand the desire for that, as do the researchers who investigate this. And they have wanted to try and combine all of the studies that have been done so far to produce some kind of global overarching conclusion. And what those meta-studies have done is this. Let's say, for example, we look at one of the specific studies that investigates drought in Kenya and asks whether that is related, correlated with an uptick in intercommunal violence in that country. And then we take another study which, say, looks at the entirety of Latin America and says, if we look at the continent as a whole and we look at episodes of flooding, flash flooding, do we find that years with more flooding are years where there is also more violent crime, right? So we have all of these different studies, they're all investigating different things, and a meta-study is where you combine all of those studies to try and reach a conclusion, try and reach some kind of general global conclusion. And the kind of conclusion that they were hoping to reach with these meta-studies was to be able to say that for every part increase, or for every kind of deviation from normal weather patterns, would lead globally to a certain percentage increase in armed violence and armed conflict. So the conclusion, what these researchers who did these meta-studies were really hoping to be able to say at the end was, look, for every percentage increase in drought, there is a similar percentage increase in armed violence globally. That was the kind of thing that they were hoping to be able to conclude. And what I'm going to do now is sort of give you a very kind of quick overview of what turned into a huge and really quite heated academic dispute between two camps who did these meta-studies but found very, very different things. So the first of these meta-studies took a whole collection of these individual studies and combined them using various kind of statistical data methods, and came to what was a really very stark and very troubling conclusion. And they found exactly this. They found that for every for every kind of standard deviation away from normal weather patterns, there was a significant percentage increase in the amount of armed violence that the world experienced. So this was a really very worrying conclusion. They, of course, accepted that, in some places this was less pronounced, and in some places it was more pronounced. But their overall conclusion was basically that, the more drought, the more hurricane strikes, the more kind of unusual, the more abnormal weather you have, the more armed violence you have, and that they had found correlation, a general global correlation between those two things, and that they could actually pin a fairly accurate percentage increase in armed violence on these deviations away from normal weather patterns. And even further, they predicted that in the future, as the planet warmed and these departures from normal weather patterns increased, that we would experience even more armed violence as a result, right? So they said they'd firstly found a correlation, but also that they could use that correlation of historical data to predict the future. And the future that they predicted was one in which, if climate change went unchecked, there would be more armed violence and conflict. So then a different group of researchers said, well, okay, we challenge that. We don't think that that's the correct conclusion. And this second group of researchers had a number of problems with their methods, with their research methods. First one being that they said that some of the studies that had been included in this first meta-study really, it didn't make sense to include them. It included, for example, studies looking way, way back into history, often several hundred years ago, or even thousands of years ago, looking at the collapse of various civilizations around the Mediterranean, at the end of the Roman Empire, various collapses of ancient Egyptian dynasties, and was using data about that it's possible to obtain from various other kind of ice core samples about what the climate was doing at those times, right? So that's like really interesting, fascinating ancient history. But this rival group of researchers were saying, yes, those individual studies are probably correct, but does it really make sense to include them in a meta-study if what we're trying to understand is episodes of armed violence in modern societies? Those ancient civilizations were so different that if what we're doing is combining studies to try and understand our current situation, those situations are really so different that they can't tell us an awful lot about now. So that was their first problem with the study. The second one was that they challenged some of their statistical methods that they'd used to combine these studies into one, and produce kind of one global average. And what they did was they kind of redid the study. They excluded the individual studies that they thought shouldn't be in there. They used different statistical methods to try and combine the studies, and they came to a completely different conclusion. They came to the conclusion that there was, in fact, no significant difference globally between climate change and armed conflict. So these two meta-studies were in complete tension. They found complete opposite conclusions. One found a significant correlation globally, the other found no correlation at all. So this left everyone who was interested in this issue in a really very difficult position. It left us in a situation where, in the absence of further studies, which are more conclusive, it leaves us in a position of not really being able to say very much. It leaves us in a position of not having that satisfying, overarching global conclusion about the link between climate change and armed conflict. So what I want to do with the final bit of this session is try to propose something of a way forward from this academic tension, from this kind of seeming academic impasse. And what I'm going to propose is that trying to look for a global, universal, general answer to this question of climate change and armed conflict just isn't very useful and isn't very helpful. And instead, we should be thinking specifically and locally. So rather than trying to invest our time and energy in producing a study which will tell us something about the overall levels of armed violence and how they relate to climate change across the entire planet, rather, we should be thinking about specific locations, specific situations, and trying to understand in those very specific places, is climate change going to become a driver of armed violence? In another specific location, is drought likely to become a driver of particular forms of conflict? Or in a completely different location, are episodes of flooding likely to lead to political opportunism and increases in civil war? Because that's actually the kind of information that is useful for trying to prevent and contain armed conflict. Because at the end of the day, our goal here surely is to try and achieve, through various kinds of policy and diplomacy, and trying to predict and understand these conflicts, our goal eventually, I hope, is to try and reduce them. And it is really only through this kind of very local, very specific research that we can begin to produce the kind of research that allows us to identify particular hotspots, to identify particular locations where this is something that we need to be worried about. And then through that information, through understanding what might happen in a specific location in the future, try to bring in various kinds of policies and interventions and peace-building programs that might prevent that conflict taking place. So my suggestion to this academic impasse, my way around this academic dispute around the levels of global conflict, is actually to say, let's not invest too much time in investigating that further. Let's focus on specific places, specific episodes, and particular places that we think may be vulnerable to episodes of climate-linked armed conflict, and invest our research resources and our energy in trying to understand those, rather than trying to come to some universal global conclusion. So what I want to do really finally, with the last sort of 5 or so minutes of this session, is look at how governments are responding to this information. How are governments and policymakers taking this information about climate change and armed conflict and bringing it into their policymaking agenda? How are they integrating this research into their policies, and how they engage with the issue of climate change, how they engage with armed conflict? How is it reflected in their political discourse? How are politicians and policymakers kind of using these arguments as they, how are they deploying these arguments in their political thinking and speaking? So I think the first thing to conclude is that very frequently, this research evidence about the link between climate change and conflict is used by politicians and policymakers to talk more broadly about the links between climate change and security. So it's very easy for a politician or a policymaker to take one of these studies and say, look, climate change is going to create armed conflict in in this particular location, and that creates a hard security issue for us as a government. It creates a situation in which we may be forced to respond militarily. That's very often the way that you find developed country governments talking and thinking and using this research. And I think the key challenge to that rhetoric, the key thing that we need to kind of critically examine when we hear those kinds of arguments is to say, well, it's certainly correct that it's creating a security situation. Conflict is a hard security issue. And it may well be the case that climate change is going to lead to changing patterns of it. But the key question always to ask is security for who? For whom does this create a security problem? And what I often find when I speak to politicians and policymakers, especially in the UK and Europe, is that what they really mean by climate change creating a security issue or security problem is they mean a security problem for their country's interests overseas. Their primary thinking is about their country's kind of business interests. It's about trade. It's about the way that they need a particular country to be stable in order to kind of continue various national interests there. And when they're talking about climate change creating a security situation there, what they're really getting at is the possibility that they may be or may want to intervene militarily in order to protect those interests. And I think our challenge to that has to be, should a developed country's economic interests really be the primary focus of our thinking here? Should it not be the humanitarian situation in that country and the people who are much more immediately caught up in that security crisis? And sometimes the language that is used in policy circles sort of disguises that and allows that conversation to go on without us ever really examining whose security it is we are looking out for in this context. So I'm going to conclude there, and with the final few minutes of this session, I'd like to take a few of your questions that have come through on chat. So I'm here with Leanne, who has been on the chat throughout the session, and she's going to relay some of the questions to me, and I will then do my best to answer them.
Yes, hi everybody. So one of the first questions that came in was about the various types of conflict, civil war between countries, etc. And there was a question around whether water issues. So, for example, if there's a river that is the boundary between two countries, could that potentially generate conflicts between countries?
Okay. Are there other questions as well? It'd be good to kind of hear a few and then make sure that I touch on all of them before we.
Yes, there's one that's actually just come in, so it's basically about whether, I'm just reading it right now, it's whether you see or expect a rise in the role of epistemic communities or technocratic focused groups, and if so, how do you think reconciling divergent interests, so for example, between security and adaptation or north and south, can be achieved?
Okay, yeah, I'll take a go at that. and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, and then there's maybe one more
Okay.
that's just come in, which is whether you can give some examples of security responses overriding humanitarian responses.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Certainly. All right. So I'll try to touch on each of those things, and then we'll draw it to a close. I think the question of disputes over water is troubling and interesting. So the one thing I would say about the connection between climate, access to water, and conflict is this: that as a planet, as a global society, we're actually quite good at resolving conflicts over water. There are a lot of disputes about access to water and access to rivers, and disputes between countries about who gets to use a river that flows into one country and then into another country. There are often disputes about whether one nation can build a dam to create a hydroelectric project, and how that affects the irrigation that another country further downstream might be using that river for. And there were disputes about those kind of things all the time, right? But the vast majority of those disputes are resolved through diplomatic channels. Countries negotiate with each other about what they're going to do. They meet, they discuss, they reach some kind of diplomatic consensus between their two countries that allows them to resolve that without ever engaging in armed violence, as a way of kind of finalizing that that dispute. Now, some of those disputes do play into episodes of armed violence or conflicts between countries, but there's actually, this is one of the kind of data sets that I didn't specifically mention. There is a database of water disputes, transboundary water disputes. And what you can see when you look at it is that most of them are resolved diplomatically rather than violently. Hopefully that will continue in the future. But the question we do have to ask is, as those water resources become more stretched, is there the potential that more of those disputes play into armed conflicts and fewer of them are resolved diplomatically? My only conclusion would be that, as water resources do become more stretched, investing in that kind of diplomacy becomes even more important. So yeah, there's a risk there. At the moment, it's not a key driver of conflict. In the future, perhaps it could be, but investment in diplomacy could potentially prevent that. So the final one I want to look at is some examples of where sort of security concerns or concerns about protecting a developed countries' national interests outweigh what might be a kind of difficult humanitarian situation on the ground. One that I'm familiar with is the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and there's a pattern of armed conflict in there between people who live in the Niger Delta and between the state, that is the Nigerian government, which is interested in exploiting the delta more extensively for fossil fuel extraction, especially oil and natural gas. And then there are a number of other international interests that are part of that those extractive industries as well. So there are nations outside Nigeria that are trying to protect their interest in the fossil fuel resources there. But then the conflict over those resources in the Niger Delta has created a humanitarian situation. But what you can see is very often countries, including the UK and the US, really deploying their military resources or their resources more generally, not to try and improve that humanitarian situation, but rather to protect their ability to get their fossil fuel resources out of the Niger Delta and onto the global market. So it's an extraordinarily complex situation there, and it's difficult for me to give a summary of it. But I think, that is a key example of where developed country governments are engaging in various kinds of, not necessarily kind of overt military action, but are deploying their military capability in order to protect their own country's interests, when perhaps the humanitarian situation in an area should be the primary focus. And there's a lot of really good work done on the Niger Delta in that situation, and I can put some links to some resources in the email that will come around next week. Apologies to people who have answered questions on the chat that I haven't got round to. I am conscious that I didn't engage with the question about kind of tensions between various different kind of research groups and epistemic communities that are investigating this. I do want to try and provide an answer for that, and I will do that via the email. So, final things, keep an eye on your inboxes for next week, because next week I will send round the recording for this session so you can rewatch it, dates and times for the future sessions, and answers to some of the questions that we didn't have time to get to today. So it just remains for me to thank you for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you for the next session.